So there is no denying the Gigabyte FI32QX is a highly impressive monitor. It's big, it's bold, but most importantly, it is very fast with a 1440p resolution, a 240Hz refresh rate that can even be increased to 270Hz via a one-click overclock. For aspiring competitive gamers then, could this be the perfect step up from a 1080p display? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out the latest high refresh rate gaming monitor from Gigabyte. This is of course the Aorus FI32QX. Not to be confused with the FI32Q Non-X that came out last year. This new and improved version sports a 1440p resolution at 240Hz, and that can even be increased to 270Hz via overclocking. It's also using a 32-inch IPS panel with neat features including display HDR 600 certification as well as a built-in KVM switch. But all of that does not come cheap, as this is currently priced around the £900 mark here in the UK. There's definitely a lot to talk about with this one then, but we'll kick things off with a look at the design. Right from the off then, I think it is pretty clear the FI32QX is fooling nobody. This is very much a gaming monitor. We can see that from the wide V-shaped stand, while the rear of the panel is full of aggressive angles and sharp edges. This is of course less obvious from the front, but there is still a bit of angulation around the Aorus logo on the bottom bezel, and that logo itself is a bit of a giveaway. Personally, I do myself prefer more minimalistic and simpler designs, but like I said from the front, I don't think it's too aggressive, and it certainly didn't bother me during the last week of use. We can't ignore the monitor's RGB lighting though, which is positioned on the back of the screen. Judging by the responses to our recent tweet on this, it seems most people aren't particularly fussed about RGB on monitors, but of course you can turn it off if you don't like it, and for the few who do enjoy it, it's just something extra. As for the stand then, this is made from metal and it feels pretty well built, and it also offers a full range of ergonomic adjustments, which is always good to see. So that means we get up to 130mm of height adjustment, there's 20 degrees of swivel in both directions, you can tilt from 5 degrees downwards to 21 degrees upwards, and there's even the full 90-degree pivot, so you could use this screen vertically if you wanted to. We also have the added bonus that VESA 100 mounts are supported, so if you've already got a custom wall mount or a monitor stand, something like that, that is also supported. One other feature I also think is really cool is the included desk clamp. So if you don't like the large V-shaped base of the stand, Gigabyte actually includes this desk mount right in the box, so you can swap it out and it really takes up a lot less space on your desktop. Now, I didn't use this as it didn't quite work for me with my setup, as I've got those RGB lighting strips that are on the back of my desk, but I do think this is a really cool inclusion, though no doubt it does also contribute to the £900 asking price. Moving on to the I/O then, on the left hand side we only find one input, and that is for power, with all of the other connectors over on the right hand side. So here we find two HDMI 2.1, and there's also one DisplayPort 1.4 video output, plus a USB Type-C that does support DP Alt mode. Next to those, there's also a USB upstream input and its two corresponding USB 3.0 downstream ports, as well as both a mic and line out option. The headphone jack is also worth mentioning, as it uses an ESS Sabre DAC. I personally have never plugged my headphones into my monitor, so this isn't really a big deal for me, but if you are the kind of person to do that, it's definitely worth pointing out. Circling back to the HDMI ports though, here we had some, shall we say, fun and games. Basically, standard procedure for my monitor reviews is to use a DisplayPort hooked up to my RTX 3090, and that was absolutely perfect with the FI32QX. However, as these are HDMI 2.1 ports, I did just want to check everything was working fine, as we do believe these are 24 gigabit per second ports as opposed to the full bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second. That shouldn't be an issue though, as this is a 1440p display, but I did just want to check everything was running fine. As it turns out, however, right now there does appear to be an issue with NVIDIA GPUs running at over 144Hz refresh rate when connected to this screen using HDMI. So I actually tried both an RTX 3090 and an RTX 3080 Ti, and they simply would not enable 240Hz refresh rate over HDMI 2.1. As soon as I tried to apply 240Hz, the screen would flicker for a little second and then revert straight back to 144Hz. I did also try an AMD RX 6900 XT, however, and that was absolutely fine at 240Hz. So honestly, I've got no idea what's going on here. There seems to be some issue with NVIDIA GPUs running at 240Hz over HDMI. I have reached out to Gigabyte with these findings, and if we do hear back from them, I'll be sure to leave a comment down below. But right now, if you do buy this monitor and you have an NVIDIA GPU, I would recommend just sticking with DisplayPort. Getting back to the design though, it's worth touching on the OSD, which is itself controlled by a nice little joystick positioned on the underside of the bottom bezel. This worked perfectly for me in use, and I also have no complaints about the OSD itself either. It's simply laid out, everything is where it should be, and it's also nice and responsive, which can't be said about every OSD system going. There is also a Windows-based app called OSD Sidekick, which lets you adjust all of the same settings directly from your desktop as long as you're connected with a USB cable. So that is another good option to have. That's enough about the design of the monitor though, so let's go ahead and talk about the panel and what it's actually like to use. And we'll kick off with our SpyderX testing. Kicking off with the gamut testing then, here we can see 100% sRGB, 100% Adobe RGB, and then 94% DCI P3 coverage. And I have to say those are all excellent results for a gaming display, though arguably we would also expect that considering the price point. As for brightness, despite Gigabyte claiming a typical brightness of 400 nits, we actually topped out at 310 nits, so that is a bit lower than advertised. I'd still say it's a respectable result, though it's not super bright, so in practice I found myself using the display at around 70% brightness in a well-lit environment. Contrast, however, is very low indeed, reported at just 560 to 1. Now, I have heard reports that some of these SpyderX colorimeter units can underreport contrast in certain situations, but no matter what settings I tweaked in the OSD, I did not see contrast above a ratio of 610 to 1, and even that is well below Gigabyte's claimed 1000 to 1 contrast ratio. Still, that claimed ratio isn't particularly impressive to begin with, so those looking for a contrasty display would likely be better served with a VA panel, but it's definitely something to note. Thankfully, out-of-the-box colour accuracy is more impressive. Here we can see an average delta E of just 1.01, with only one of the 48 colour channels exceeding a delta E of 3. As we'd expect, this does improve further once we've calibrated the monitor, with a new average delta E of just 0.71, which really is a superb result, while the maximum value as well has also fallen to 2.48. Moving on from colour accuracy then, it's time to talk response times, and this is actually a new addition to our monitor testing. So we're using the open source response time tool, which has been developed by Tech Team GB, and we're testing the FI32QX at its maximum 270Hz refresh rate. There's also a few different overdrive settings in the OSD, which we'll go through, starting with overdrive turned off. Honestly, the results here from this first set of figures show us that Gigabyte is definitely using a good quality panel. That's because we see an average grey to grey figure of 7.87 milliseconds before any overdrive is introduced, and that is definitely a good result in my book. Of course, there's also no overshoot as there's no overdrive enabled. Bumping the overdrive up to the picture quality mode definitely improves things, as we still completely avoid any overshoot, but response times are better still, now averaging 6.61 milliseconds. The panel does seem to struggle most when transitioning from the lighter shades, which you can see in the bottom left of the response time heat map, but it's still decent overall. We get our best results though when using the balance overdrive mode. This still keeps overshoot to a minimum, with the panel actually only exceeding its targets on just 3 transitions, while grey to grey times are further improved, with a new average of 5.47 milliseconds. The transitions from the lighter shades though are still the most problematic. Lastly, we did also test the speed overdrive mode, and while this does improve the initial response times up to 3.93 milliseconds, as a result of the significant overshoot though, the actual perceived response times have increased, with a new average of 6.71 milliseconds. In practice, I just found the overshoot was quite noticeable, and I just wouldn't recommend using this mode. If you're wondering why we've only focused on the picture quality, balance and speed overdrive modes, when there is actually another one called Smart OD in the OSD settings, well, that's actually because I don't think Smart OD is particularly good. So it's not actually a true variable overdrive mode, but rather it just engages which of those other 3 overdrive modes it thinks will work best given the selected refresh rate. At 165 Hz for instance, Smart OD actually uses the balance overdrive mode, which we can see here, and this does show a fair amount of overshoot and average grey to grey times of 6.38 milliseconds. In my own testing, however, using the picture quality mode at 165 Hz just gives much better results. Overshoot is kept to a minimum, and that helps perceived response times improve to 5.7 milliseconds. Based on that testing then, I recommend using the balance overdrive mode at 200 Hz and above. If your game can push over 200 FPS, the balance overdrive mode will just give you the best response times with minimal overshoot. Below 200 Hz though, I recommend using picture quality, as otherwise balance just introduces too much overshoot at those lower refresh rates. Rounding out our testing then with a final head-to-head comparison. Here we're looking at all of the screens we've tested with their average grey to grey performance using their best overdrive modes. Of the 4 screens we've tested then, we can see the FI32QX is taking the top spot with its best result of 5.47 milliseconds. As already mentioned though, we have only just started doing this response time testing, so obviously there is a lot more work to be done to add in other monitors to this chart, but right now the FI32QX is sitting at the top. Still on the topic of speed, I do just want to cover system latency, for which we use Nvidia's LDAP tool. As we'd expect, this is another very impressive area for the FI32QX. Now, it may not be miles faster than the likes of the Yamaha GB2770QSU, but actually the reduction in latency from 8.9 milliseconds to 8.1 milliseconds actually works out as a 9% improvement, so it's definitely something. Then again, only the most competitive of gamers are likely to notice, but I'd say lower latency is always better. So that's been a lot of data thrown your way, but I do actually want to talk about in subjective terms what it's really like to use this monitor for gaming in the real world. Specifically, we know there are a ton of 1440p 165Hz monitors out there, so does the jump up to 240Hz actually make a difference? Well, this is obviously going to depend from person to person and how sensitive you are to different refresh rates, but I can only speak from my experience, and after a week of use with the FI32QX, switching back to my 144Hz EVE Spectrum, it definitely did feel a bit sluggish in comparison. Of course, you are going to have to play games that will actually push 200 to 240 FPS at 1440p, which really is not easy, but I definitely got there in Rocket League, for instance, and even playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare at lower settings, I was in the kind of 180 to 200 FPS region, so that is pretty close. I do also feel that 1440p at 240Hz gives you a good degree of, I guess, future-proofing, for want of a better term. That's because if you're playing AAA games today, you're obviously not going to be getting close to 240 FPS, but it does give you plenty of headroom to upgrade your GPU, maybe even twice in the coming years, and still get very good usage out of this display. One other thing I want to mention as well, kind of just more in terms of general use, is going to be the overall pixel density, and that's just because 1440p resolution over a 32-inch display isn't going to be the absolute sharpest, and you may well notice the difference if you're coming from a 27-inch 1440p screen or maybe even a 4K display. That said, it is actually the same pixel density as a 24-inch 1080p screen, which for many is going to be absolutely fine, and for me, I had no issues with it during my week of use, so it is something maybe to be aware of, but for me it's not an issue. We do also get adaptive sync with the FI32QX, but strangely I don't think there's even an official FreeSync certification, which is definitely a bit strange. That said, I did all of my testing with an RTX 3090 with G-Sync enabled, and it was absolutely fine with no flickering or any other artifacting. And I would also say that the FI27QX is actually officially G-Sync compatible, so it would not surprise me if the FI32QX got the same treatment in the near future. Moving on though, I do also want to talk about HDR, as this screen is Display HDR 600 certified. Now that does mean we do get some local dimming, but only in the form of 16 edge-lit zones, so it's honestly not fantastic and isn't really going to improve contrast by much. Additionally, I also noticed that peak brightness only measured at 531 nits on my SpyderX colorimeter, but actually despite that, I found the overall gaming experience with HDR on was better than I was expecting. It definitely can look a bit flat compared to SDR, but highlights are noticeably more detailed and well exposed in Cyberpunk, for instance. Personally, I would still stick to gaming with SDR, but I have definitely seen plenty of monitors with worse HDR implementations than what we have here. Lastly, it is also worth touching on viewing angles, but really only to say that there was no issue with color shift or anything like that, which honestly we wouldn't expect from a quality IPS panel. I did notice just a couple of hotspots when looking at backlight bleed, particularly in the bottom left and top left corners, but for me this wasn't noticeable while gaming, so I wouldn't count it as a significant issue. Overall then, there is definitely a lot to like about the Gigabyte Aorus FI32QX. I personally really like gaming at this resolution and refresh rate, while the increase in size to a 32-inch panel is definitely appreciated as well. Throw in the impressive response times, and overall it is safe to say we get a very fluid gaming experience from this monitor. Honestly, the main drawback, aside from that weird HDMI issue with Nvidia GPUs, really is going to come down to pricing, as right now the FI32QX is on sale for £840 from Overclockers UK, though that is even a temporary deal, down from its regular price of £909. Compared to other 27-inch 1440p 240Hz screens then, it definitely does look quite pricey, although in fairness Gigabyte did point out to us things like the built-in KVM switch, and obviously the fact that the panel itself is larger, as well as the HDR 600 certification when many other competitors are limited to HDR 400. Still, that sort of price does also put you firmly in 4K 144Hz territory. So if you're not absolutely set on getting a 240Hz panel, you could get something that is going to give you a much more detailed image at a still pretty fast 144Hz refresh rate. However, I do know that many people watching are going to be here for the 240Hz refresh rate, and like I said, I really do think 1440p 240Hz is a very good place to be, as this monitor could last you through 1 or 2 GPU upgrades. So overall, it is definitely an impressive monitor. I've really enjoyed using it over the last week. For that 1440p 240Hz refresh rate though, you do definitely have to pay handsomely for the privilege. That is going to do it for this review though, guys, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, I want to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts on this screen down in the comments below. While you're there, please do subscribe and ding that notification bell if you haven't already, and why not come chat with us over on our Discord server, which is linked in the description below. While you're there, you can also check out a link to our merch store, and if you're feeling particularly generous, you could even back us on Patreon, where you can see some of our content early and get access to exclusive giveaways. That is going to do it for this one though, guys. I'm Dominic 4Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.